Welcome, everyone, once again to the Roundtable, the editors and publishers podcast at The American Mind. I am your host, Ryan Williams, president of the Claremont Institute and publisher of the Claremont Review books and The American Mind. I am joined by managing editor Mike Sabo and associate editor of the Claremont Review books, Spencer Clavin. Spencer is also the crossover matrimonial editor for celebrities and NFL players. But we promised ourselves first and foremost, let alone
you
all
brought
of
up
you,
the subject
that we would not bring up the subject of, I won't even mention their names.
Right. I will be officiating, however. I just some personal news. Yeah.
I just want to know how much he spent on the ring. No, sorry. We must.
It's your mom's ring in your pocket. Anyway, about 5% of our listeners will understand that.
Yeah. Well, we thought we'd open today with a segment on the open question of whether perhaps Trump has gotten a bit ahead of his skis. We'll see. I wanted to bring up a few topics, one of which is this just announced, I think 2 days ago, deal with Intel. Trump, maybe a week or so ago, don't quote me, the timing really doesn't matter. It was very recently, was calling for the ouster of the CEO of Intel, which a company that has, after being a leading chip manufacturer and fabricator for many years, I think its high point was in 2020, has now lost 60% of its value. In the last 5 years, the scuttlebutt amongst folks who follow this stuff is that they've had some bad management. They're also struggling with some of their younger, but now well-advanced and better capitalized and more profitable competitors like AMD and NVIDIA. So Trump tells the story. He told it the other day at the Oval Office, I think yesterday, where he said, well, he came in to save his job, that is the CEO of Intel, and he saved it. And what we got in return was a 9.9% stake. They round up, so they just say 10% stake in Intel. The mechanism for this is the CHIPS Act, in part, along with some classified program called Enclave or something like that. Doesn't matter. We don't really know what those details are. But the CHIPS Act part, the Biden administration gave an $11 billion subsidy to Intel. And the quick and dirty explanation of this arrangement now is that now in return, the U.S. government has a 10% stake or so in Intel. Now, the trying to fend off some criticism, I think they emphasize that this is a non-voting position on the board. I think the U.S. government and the taxpayer, though we can critique that, has a stake in the company, but not a voting position and no board influence, although they reserve the right in select circumstances to exercise some control. As we could imagine, the libertarian right, and actually not just the libertarian right, plenty of more mainstream Republicans are somewhat aghast at this arrangement. It's not completely without precedent. Some folks on Twitter summoned up this arrangement of a consortium of chip makers from the 1980s, subsequent to Reagan signing off on this consortium act that loosened antitrust prohibitions on sharing of information and cooperation between chip manufacturers. Back then, the big players included Japan, so it was sort of pre the rise of China. But that was sort of guaranteed loans or maybe an investment stake in the consortium. As far as I can tell, it did not involve an actual ownership stake in the company. Howard Lutnick is pitching this as against the cries of socialism or creeping government stakes in corporations, which actually, from a more textbook perspective, it would be characterized as national socialist rather than socialist. But we don't need to get caught up in the semantics, and throwing around the fascist label, especially in this day and age, is usually more counterproductive than it is helpful. So I'll just table all that. But Lutnick says, no, it's not socialism. The American people just got a stake in this company, and the company's made more viable. It's capitalism, which is a fairly creative interpretation of capitalism. Now, this is just an example of, I think, the Trump administration's penchant for doing more and creative things in industrial policy. I suspect our friends at American Compass, the sort of leading think tank for a revamped industrial policy, are in favor of this sort of thing. But it is fairly unprecedented. And I think the libertarian critiques here continue to hold their purchase, which is to say it's pretty distortive. Is Intel now, as the darling of the federal government because of its ownership stake, going to be given preferential treatment, thus resulting in some downstream effects like making political rather than business decisions in terms of chips? The Trump administration is defending it on the grounds that this is a vital part of our future national competitiveness in and viability in this very important space of semiconductors and chips, especially with the rise of the importance now at gallop speed of AI. I don't know. What do you guys think? Is this something to be provisionally somewhat alarmed about? My final point is, when Mike Pence and David Bahnsen and some others sort of decry this in somewhat hyperbolic terms, my initial inclination is to be skeptical of the criticism as some very mild version of TDS. But I must say, I have a great amount of sympathy for this position. Trump has also announced that he'd like to do this a lot more. And for Trump, this just looks like a good deal for the American people. He thinks of it as, we got a 10% stake for free and we'll make some money off of it. When that's not really the case, considering it's a rebate on a subsidy that was floated on our giant mountain of debt. So at a certain point, the US taxpayer has a 10% stake in this, but it's basically mortgaging their grandchildren to do it, even though it's a tiny piece of a giant bucket of debt. I don't know. This seems like it could have a bunch of unintended consequences and it seems like it might be short-sighted to me and maybe a bad precedent, especially when the White House changes hands, as it will inevitably do.
Yeah, it makes me a little queasy, especially the part about wanting to do a lot more of it. This is the sort of thing that seems so delicate as a judgment call that its quality is actually in its quantity, if that makes sense. When you're dealing with matters of prudence, doing more of a thing actually amounts to doing a different kind of thing. It also, and this is what really troubles me, it speaks to the gray area in which modern warfare exists, I think, because if we were at war with China, this sort of thing could plausibly be defended under a kind of guns and butter heading. You would say, look, AI is going to be the operative technology in drone warfare. It's already maximizing the efficiency of these unpredictable strikes, sometimes on civilians. China's an unreliable, bad faith actor. And so the government actually has a vested interest in sort of stepping in to production here. But we're not at war with China, at least not ostensibly. And there have been many long think pieces written about whether we are in some sort of Cold War. If will we ever declare war? If we do end up in war with China, how will we know? And that's because the instruments of warfare in the 21st century are so much more nebulous and covert. They're economic, they're technological, they are cultural and social. And it does China's government operating via TikTok to perform kind of psychological manipulation, does that count as an act of Cold Warfare? Like, these are, to me, quite legitimate questions that nobody seems to have really thought through. And it's in that domain that I would think a heavy hand for the government in the economy would make sense and be justified. And it's along those lines that I would like to sort of reason before monkeying around with a company like Intel. And it just doesn't seem to me like these are the sorts of things that anybody has really like thought through or really knows quite what to say about. So I would tread carefully here.
So my inclination, Ryan, is kind of the same as yours. First seeing the critics who are really jumping all over Trump, seeing, AEI, seeing Cato, all the usual people, Rand Paul crying socialism. When socialism, I mean, that has been used to just, if you basically take their definition of socialism, you read that back into American history. Okay, pretty much most of the American political tradition, especially in political economy, is socialist. So I'm just knee-jerk skeptical of all that. In this case, I think it remains to be seen what this actually looks like. Whether they're a member, I think they're going to be a member of the board and non-voting member. The deal has yet to go through too. I mean, there's a lot of upheaval. The Intel CEO, I think, basically was going to resign. Now it looks like that's not happening. I feel like there's kind of so many moving pieces and parts. I mean, part of, I think, Trump trying to deal with what's going on in, with China, with Taiwan, probably trying to head China off at the pass there early on before any kind of actual shooting war kind of starts. And there's always some issue about his personal, business. You saw the same thing with him accepting, I think, a plane in Air Force One, essentially from Qatar. That was, I think, $400 million or even higher than that. And that gives kind of his critics kind of grist for the mill there. So there's always something, should he do it? Can he do it? Should he do it? Those are two separate questions. But this just does seem like a little bit of a gray area. Trump, I think, just with his communication style, can not always be the best in terms of how he communicates these things in a very clear manner, and kind of leaves it up to the impression that there's graft here, there's kind of political shenanigans and all kind of stuff kind of happening behind the scenes. So to me, I mean, I'm a fan of American Compass and kind of what they're doing. So I'm perhaps a little bit skeptical about this. I mean, again, I've also seen some smart people who kind of have some pushback to this. So I'll wait and see. It remains to be seen. But for me, it does seem a little bit odd, and it does kind of actually bring to mind too, 2008 and the financial crisis. The government, I think, gave General Motors, I think it was $50 billion for essentially, I think it was like a 60% stake when they were on the verge of bankruptcy. And I think the government actually ended up with, I'm getting this from the Associated Press, about $10 billion after it sold stock in GM. So you do have some issues. Typically, what's looked at, especially in terms of modern economists, is that it's only the bad side of when the government gets involved and not the good side. I'm just thinking of R&D, what David Goldman would always talk about. That side is very important, and that's not necessarily socialism. So again, we'll see what happens. I'm perhaps a little bit skeptical, but less than what I've been seeing online, certainly.
Yeah, there's the somewhat arbitrariness of it too. I mean, it's the sort of nature of the modern presidency to operate in this way, and it certainly did not originate with Trump, although he's taken advantage of this tendency. I'm not a student of the CHIPS Act, but I read that there's really no legislative mechanism to make this a piece of that subsidy. So it's sort of ultra legislative in various ways. But then again, half of our modern executive branch is ultra legislative. So that's, I suppose, a general criticism of the tendency of the last few decades rather than any specific indictment of Trump. So I suppose, if one of our perennial themes is in this vacuum, the executive has stepped, and if Congress wanted to fix it, they could. I suspect they're unlikely to do that, just given the nature of the relationship between the White House and the slim majority in the House, let alone the situation in the Senate. And then there's also the argument has been made that yes, chips are important; they're a vital part of national security. But there's a much less obtrusive way of doing this without all of the possible cronyist pitfalls of direct government stake. And that would just be for the US government to guarantee a certain amount of chip purchases through DoD ahead of time, and thus to incentivize Intel in a more indirect way, or to sort of help bolster Intel in its time of trouble in order to support a more robust backbone of chip manufacturing in the US, or really, I should say, outside China, because a lot of this goes on in Taiwan. So we'll see. I mean, it's something to keep an eye on. I hope this does not become a cascading practice by the federal government, but I think Trump will be sorely tempted, because to him, it just looks like more revenue coming in and a good deal for the American people without a proper consideration of the constitutional precedent and the downstream unintended consequences. A couple of other things from the Trump world news, or from news in Trump world, I should say, with the administration. There's this, I still don't know quite what he's up to. Perhaps he's completely sincere in saying the DC federal troop intervention has been so successful that now they're going to take it on the road to blue cities. despite the fact that there not really being much of a constitutional mechanism for National Guard law enforcement spreading to cities, especially cities and states where they don't consent to it. I suspect that Trump may just be mixing it up and wanting to continue to put his Democratic enemies on the back foot and the poor rhetorical position of saying, why would you intervene in our city? Crime is not a problem in blue cities, when the demonstrable fact is quite to the contrary to anyone who lives in a blue city or who has followed the news. I think DC, DC is one of the top 10 most dangerous cities in the world, or it was until about 10 days ago. So that the sort of meta argument Trump would continue to win, but the actual mechanism for introducing federal troops, especially absent some declaration of insurrection or request by the state of Illinois, if you just take Chicago as an example, would this is not going to happen. Now, it just remains to be seen whether Trump's really serious about it or whether he just wants to goad his political adversaries into poor rhetorical positions.
So I kind of see that in the same way as Trump talking about Canada as the 51st state. As Greenland too, same thing, where he just keeps pushing it and pushing it and pushing it, even well past the time where critics have, pointed out, some problems or some flaws. I see it too. I just see it as kind of a humiliation effort of the Democrats where they've let their cities just go completely to pot, and he just keeps pointing it out and pointing it out and pointing it out. I think obviously with DC, with home rule, I mean, there's obvious powers that Congress actually has in there to do what they're doing. In these other cities, if Trump were to do what he says he's going to do, I think there are, it's not even a gray area. I think there are definitely some much larger issues at stake. So I see it the same way too. I just think he's basically poking at them, humiliating them, and letting people see, what some of our major U.S. cities have come to.
I like the idea, Ryan, of the National Guard as the touring company of some kind of Broadway show. I think that's very reminiscent of Mel Brooks and the producers. And the dances they do will be daring and new. Turn, turn, kick, turn, 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 kick, turn. 1, 2, 3, kick, turn. Yeah, this is the sort of thing, Mike, as you say, it could just be posturing. It could be political maneuvering to get them to continue saying such things as, what's wrong with crime? We love crime. It's part of the vibrant culture of our third world shithole. If he does do it, I think there are major problems. That would be one of the places where I would want, I've said before in this podcast, I want a button that I can press that just delivers one short, sharp smack to the back of Donald Trump's head. Like, stop that, cut that, like roll up a newspaper and kind of whack him over the forehead, because he has such good instincts. And then every now and then, as we've been discussing on the segment, you just think that's a mistake. And he is quite responsive to that sort of criticism, actually, from his friends and allies. So it's not as if I think he's sitting around scheming for ways. You listen now, if you ever drop in on any moderately left-wing podcasts like Pod Save America, Slate Political Gabfest, it's like being transported into an alternate universe in which the United States is not simply on the verge of martial law, but has been plunged into an authoritarian nightmare for nigh on 6 months. And they talk about this as if Trump is just scheming, rubbing his hands together, trying to figure out ways. If only he could get around all these constitutional protections, then there would be jackboots on the ground in every city in America. So that's clearly a fantasy. I don't think that's what's going on at all. But I also don't think, as Brian, I think, kind of indicated, that he's really thinking this stuff through too terribly hard. And he might just be kind of waiting for the courts to stop him. And if that's what he's doing, that is kind of what we got so mad at Biden for, with a lot of the vaccine mandate stuff and the debt forgiveness that he tried to pull. He said, look, I'm going to ask forgiveness, not permission, basically. And at some point, the Supreme Court is going to rein me in. If that's the approach Trump is taking here, then I think in good faith, we have to kind of say, no bueno. But like you say, we don't know that this is actually what he's doing. He might just be trolling people and inviting them to take unpopular positions, as he certainly is doing, I think, in the case of the executive order on flag burning.
Yeah, I want to bring up TARP for just a moment, because it has a lot to do, I think, with an alternative timeline from the last couple decades. So whatever TARP stood for, Assistance Relief Program, I forget what the first letter stood for. But the Bush administration and the Obama administrations continued. You mentioned it, Mike. The bailouts of the last sort of bond market scare around the housing crisis, that were right at the tail end with Henry Paulson in the middle of it, the Treasury Secretary under George W. Bush. And it was bailing out of banks, a liquidation of a couple of these investment houses, Bear Stearns being maybe the lead example, and Lehman. And so the alternate timeline is the sort of inner libertarian in us all on economic matters, especially those of us who've studied, the history of business cycles and malinvestment and all of that, driven by artificial government printing, money printing, or distorted money supply, or in the case of the housing crisis, this ill-fated and ill-conceived attempt by the George W. Bush administration to increase minority home ownership, which led to the issuance of a lot of really bad mortgage debt to lenders who should not have been lent money, who were disproportionately minorities, just given the overlapping circles of minority Americans and income distribution. This was going to be the disproportionate picture of this whole thing in terms of who was getting those loans. Remember the NINJA, the no income, no job loan. My favorite anecdote from the period, which I heard from a friend whose future father-in-law was sort of I think a CFO at a medium-sized investment firm in the Midwest. And he was driving into work one day, and the parking lot attendant asked him, did he need a mortgage? Because the parking lot attendant's cousin or his brother-in-law or whatever was a mortgage lender. And basically the somewhat senior executive in question called an emergency board meeting and said, we are getting out of the housing market, because when the parking lot attendant's cousin is offering you a mortgage on great terms, this here be a bubble, boy, and save the company hundreds of millions of dollars by exiting just in the nick of time. It's one of those instances of sort of serendipitous intuition and just the luck of getting pitched something that seemed way too good to be true, and was. Now, if normal market forces, with all of that malinvestment driven by Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, if you had allowed all those bad actors to collapse, and look, the argument from Paulson and others at the time, and this is always a political judgment thing, who knows if they were right or wrong, their argument was we have to intervene because if we don't, the global economy is going to crash. Now, the sort of old Austrian economist and all of us would say, yeah, that's true, and that's going to be very painful, but it will liquidate a bunch of this malinvestment and will free up a lot of capital and housing market stock. And so you could see an alternate timeline where if we had let that crash go, you might have had half a generation or a generation of millennials and Zoomers who now would be in much more affordable housing, because it would not have been propped up. We've basically been propped up on a sea of printed money in the housing market since then. We have yet to really correct for that. And then COVID accelerated, et cetera. So you could see a national housing market picture in which prices were 30 to 40% lower because of that necessary correction. And the argument from the libertarians and Austrian economists would be, look, that pain is coming someday. We have just postponed it. And in the meantime, we've propped up a bunch of inefficient allocation of capital. And some of the people hardest hit are young folks trying to buy houses. So that's sort of a big cautionary tale. Obviously, the 10% stake in Intel is nowhere near that sort of thing going on, but it just should cause us some concern with this trend. You mentioned flag burning, Spencer. Before we get to flag burning, which actually is slightly different than these first three items where we're being a little critical of Trump, but we'll get to that. I wanted to mention just this last thing. So Trump has also been getting some grief from not just like normie establishment conservatives, but a broader section of the MAGA right, when he said in the Oval Office the other day, we need good relations with China. If people are talking about not letting their students in, we're going to let their students in. 600,000. He's talking about higher ed applicants from China. And Lutnick was on Laura Ingram's show defending it. She said, "How is this America first, letting a bunch of CCP students into the United States?" And Lutnick said, well, it's just Trump's being a pragmatic businessman. It's just a matter of economics. If you don't let this big surge of Chinese students in, and I think at the backdrop of that, though he didn't say it, would be other international students too, which those who've studied higher education know pay full freight, and it's a big boon to higher education in America to have foreign students paying full tuition so that they can subsidize their other students and generally rake in money. Lutnick's argument was if we don't allow this to happen, then the bottom 15% of the higher education market and those colleges will all go out of business. And I thought this was just it's for those of us who have been critical of, and our colleague Scott Yenner has been an education policy expert and has been doing a lot of work on this subject for us. As he has argued, and we agree with, way too many people are going to college in America right now anyway.
Yeah, if you're going to let the global economy crash for the sake of clearing out the housing market, you can certainly let the academy fall to pieces.
Why prop? I mean, the notion that Lutnick thinks this is a good argument on his side of the aisle is wild to me. Why would we prop up the bottom 15% of higher education, especially because higher ed as a general class, there are certain exceptions, and we've named them all on this show. They're all friendly, small liberal arts colleges, mostly, that have good missions and teach sane things about America. Higher education as a whole is a cesspool of anti-American propaganda. Why on earth would you prop it up through a bunch of Chinese students? And again, I think if it was presented properly to Trump, he just thought, yeah, why wouldn't I take full freight from a bunch of Chinese students? It's an infusion of cash into the economy in general, so I like it. Now, there's an argument, I forget who made it, some anon account, about this being 4D chess. And, it's just a sort of rhetorical gambit with China, and it's luring them into a sweeter feeling with us. The crackdown will come in some macro way on all sorts of fronts, and this is not really a serious proposal. That seems to me to be way too fancy, and this seems like just a very bad idea.
No, I totally agree. I think, like Laura Ingraham pointed out, I mean, that's the obvious retort. Like, how exactly is this America First propping up like an absolutely acidic and corrosive higher education institution that's taught students to hate America? Like, how about let the bottom 15%? They're that bad. So how about let them fail? Like, go out of business. We want good colleges. We want more Hillsdales. We want more Thomas Aquinas's. We want more University of Dallas's. Like, we don't want the absolute garbage that's been peddled to us for decades. So yeah, I think it's another misstep. And I do think it's just Trump off the top of his head thinking, okay, yeah, more money, more cash, more American greatness. We're going to have, China's top students, whatever, coming here. Okay, even with that said, I mean, there's way more considerations than that. So I definitely think that is short-sighted.
Confucius say the poison fruit of foreign espionage grow in the overwatered garden of the woke academy. I just think this is a good example of the case for distinguishing between kinds of foreign students and by proxy kinds of immigrants. We've talked before about the difference between shutting down immigration generally versus devoting attention and resources to what sorts of immigrants you let in, skills-based immigration being the kind of obvious one here to talk about. And there's disagreement in the Trump camp over whether it's immigration full stop or whether it's the kinds of immigration that we're concerned about. Surely, if we ever get the country over this hurdle where we're trying to claw back the results of Biden's open borders policy, then at some point we're going to have some policy about whom we do let into this country. And I would like to see it be much more tailored to not just the skills of the immigrant, but the philosophy of the immigrant and their genuine willingness to sign up to an old-fashioned term, the American creed. I know we have some exercises in lip service that we currently march immigrants through, but the fact of dual citizenship and just the general kind of lightness with which our native citizens hold their American identity makes it pretty toothless to make these demands of immigrants. Whereas if you genuinely did meet immigrants at the gate with a set of serious creedal propositions to which they were asked to ascribe, and then followed that up with a national ethos of Americanism, you would, I think, be able to get a lot more general assent to a much more robust immigrant economy and general flow of immigrants after you've dealt with the current morass and situation. Now, I say all that as a preface to kind of take that and make it an analog for the situation in academia. Much like America more generally, academia, perhaps even more, is not interested in assimilating the people that come from overseas. It's interested in doing the opposite. It's interested in taking people who might otherwise be persuadable, indoctrinable, as if you will, into the American creed and turning them into anti-American psychopaths. And that's basically what many of these institutions now exist to do, at the same time as the CCP is like known to be operating all sorts of weird psyops on American campuses, the Confucius Institutes being among the most famous. But there are foreign Chinese students and foreign Chinese students. Some of them are in the employ of the communist government. Others are fleeing or trying to get out from under the oppressive CCP. And it matters which kinds of students these are. And it matters what we teach them once they get here. And all of those things are, to me, much more pressing concerns than 15% of these liberal arts colleges will collapse if you don't, pump Chinese cash into them. Let them burn. I mean, the way that they are, like, let them fall into the ground, salt the earth. Like, they can end up a sinkhole for all I care. But if we want to take seriously the question of, like, what should our policy on foreign students be, it shouldn't actually be about keeping all of these many DEI hires in cigars and hair dye. It should be about trying to discriminate in a healthy way between good and bad foreign students, as we should be discriminating between good and bad immigrants.
Yeah, quite right. We wanted to end this little segment on a mixed note. That is to say, the White House has this executive order that was promulgated on the 25th of August, the title of which is Prosecuting Burning of the American Flag. And the usual quarters, that is the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, the sort of libertarian speech maximalists, and Brit Hume and others across the sort of establishment conservative or right-wing press and activism and think tank world have decried this, citing Texas v. Johnson, the 1989 case that said it was constitutional to burn the American flag. But I would say that they're barking up the wrong tree, I think, because it's a fairly clever executive order. And let me just read it to you. It's not very long. I'll read the relevant parts anyway. The section 1, the purpose part, is a bunch of boilerplate on the American flag being a special symbol in our national life. It shouldn't be desecrated, et cetera,
you don't say. A special symbol.
I'll skip to the end of the purpose section. Burning this representation of America may incite violence and riot. American flag burning is also used by groups of foreign nationals as a calculated act to intimidate and threaten violence against Americans because of their nationality and place of birth. Notwithstanding the Supreme Court's rulings on First Amendment protections, the court has never held that American flag desecration conducted in a manner that is likely to incite imminent lawless action, or that is an action amounting to, quote, fighting words, is constitutionally protected, and that they cite Texas v. Johnson, page 408 to 410. My administration will act to restore respect and sanctity to the American flag and prosecute those who incite violence or otherwise violate our laws while desecrating the symbol of our country to the fullest extent permissible under any available authority. Section 2 is specific measures to combat desecration of the American flag. The Attorney General shall prioritize the enforcement to the fullest extent possible of our nation's criminal and civil laws against acts of American flag desecration that violate applicable content-neutral laws while causing harm unrelated to expression consistent with the First Amendment. And so, given their preface, they mean consistent with Texas v. Johnson's holding on the First Amendment and flag burning. That's how I read that. This may include, but is not limited to, violent crimes, hate crimes, illegal discrimination against American citizens or other violations of American civil rights, and crimes against property and the peace, as well as conspiracies and attempts to violate and aiding and abetting others to violate such laws. In cases where the Department of Justice or another executive department or agency determines that an instance of American flag desecration may violate an applicable state or local law, such as open burning restrictions, disorderly conduct laws, or destruction of property laws, the agency shall refer the matter to the appropriate state or local authority for potential action, etc. So this seems to me to be kind of probing around the edges of Texas v. Johnson. And it's also a kind of just a signal to especially that group of foreign residents who want to provoke American citizens by burning flags that they will have a sharper eye than usual on their conduct. And it seems to me that the point of this is to circumscribe that behavior by highlighting the fact that we will watch it all very closely. And if you step even a toe over the line of our modern definition of free speech, which includes free expression, which we've had issues with at the Claremont Institute since Texas v. Johnson, but that's maybe a conversation for another day. I'll just quote the late, great Professor Harry Jaffa, who said, all speech is expression, but not all expression is speech. So it's long been our position at the Claremont Institute that nude dancing and maybe even flag burning wouldn't constitute protected speech, either under long traditions of common law or under the traditions of the First Amendment in America. But much ink has been spilled on the proper scope and limits of the First Amendment. And that's a discussion for another day. But I think if you read this closely, the EO is aimed to provoke anti-Americanism. And so in that sense is a rhetorical trap, at least, if not a trap for enterprising and perhaps a little too exuberant expressors of speech, that is to say, breaking other laws while they're doing it. In fact, we have a recent example, I think, from yesterday. We're recording here on Tuesday. Maybe it was even this morning. An alleged, on his own description, 20-year veteran burned a flag outside the White House while yelling into the bullhorn that Trump was a dictator and a fascist, and he, had served his country in opposition to all these things that the president stands for, apparently, in this executive order. But he was arrested for basically burning something on public land in the district. I suspect he did it at the park across the street from the White House. So this already has its first test case, I suppose. But I think the outrage about it seems to me to be misplaced, and the executive order was calculated to foment that outrage.
Well, first of all, point of order, there's nude dancing and then there's nude dancing. I mean, let's not get ahead of ourselves. I just, no, but
there is no First Amendment fine line. No, okay. All right.
Protection. Yes. First of all, it's never occurred to me quite, but it is interesting to think that if you think that burning a flag is legitimately protected as an act of free speech, then surely you must also think that Jack Phillips having to bake a cake for a gay wedding is an instance of coerced speech, which is a nicety that might be too much to expect from the people that are trying to hound Jack Phillips into the ground. But that's sort of a peripheral issue. This, unlike some of the other stuff we've talked about so far today, this seems to me like a stroke of genius on Trump's part, to be perfectly frank. I mean, that text that you just read, Ryan, is like, if you burn a flag while also doing illegal things, you will be prosecuted for doing illegal things. And also, it's very bad to burn flags. But we're going to keep within bounds, the narrow bounds defined by the Supreme Court. So Molon Lavet, come and get it. And this is brilliant, I think, because he can't plausibly be accused of falling afoul of the court. He's baiting his enemies into insisting not only that they love crime in blue cities, but that they love burning flags and that this is a sacred American right that must be upheld. And he's forcing an important issue, and this has not been enough remarked upon, which is that when this matter was first brought before the Supreme Court, flag burning was the quintessential instance of an extreme test case for our tradition of free speech in this country. It was akin to Nazis being allowed to march in Skokie or some other, it was akin to John Adams defending the redcoats, right? It was like, because we believe in these principles of law, we are going to use as an example even this incredibly distasteful thing that vast majorities of reasonable people on the left and the right can agree is reprehensible. Nevertheless, we think it's protected speech. Now, you can contest whether that argument is right, but that was the point of raising flag burning. Now, the modern left being what it is, and the Democrat Party being run the way it is, and having said what it has said about this country and its founding principles and its history and the embeddedness of racism into the very fabric of our DNA, what reason does the Democratic Party in 2025 have to even dislike flag burning? Why shouldn't they burn flags? They basically think that this country was founded in infamy and conceived in error and probably should be given back to the kind of coalition of Native American tribes that originally held this land. So not only do they have to defend the right to burn flags in the abstract, they also kind of have to defend burning flags actively and all that it stands for and represents. And that, to me, is kind of an embodiment of everything that makes Trump's enemies look bad. So that's a really clever thing on Trump's part, I think, to raise this issue again now when the thing that is involved, the actual act, has suddenly become like a major plank of the Democrat Party.
Yeah, you look at, I mean, you tie this to the student protests over 10/7, the marches happening in New York City, at Columbia and other universities. I mean, this is clearly politically motivated. I think it is very smart. I think this actually is 4D chess, unlike some of the other things, deploying the National Guard to Chicago. I think, this is Trump at his best, really putting his enemies into a bind. I mean, we're supposed to believe, so the left claims that, burning the flag is the highest form of patriotism, teaching that, slavery is the fundamental principle of this country. Old white men were, basically ran this country into the ground until, 2008 when Barack Obama was elected president. First time that Michelle Obama, had some sympathy or some, even love for her country. I mean, so this is a really brilliant move. And especially, too, I mean, JD Vance, I think, tweeted this out earlier. And I'll just read this. Antonin Scalia, this is on the Texas v. Johnson case. Scalia was a justice on that case. He was a great Supreme Court justice and a genuinely kind and decent person. The presidency is consistent with Texas v. Johnson. And Texas v. Johnson was wrong and William Rehnquist was right, which I think that basically hits at all the major points. I think the more, fire and the more libertarian-oriented kind of free speech places, I think they're just out of step with really when you look at the history of free speech. Tom West has written a lot about that. He wrote a great CRB piece about that probably 2 decades ago now. So I think that this should invite us to really look back and say, okay, did the founders just believe in some free-floating libertarian, pure autonomy views on speech, especially? No, they didn't. There was a moral order. There was a natural law that was cabining all this within basically upholding the fundamental tenets of Republican government, and that's what it was about.
They loved nude dancing, just to be clear.
Oh,
last two of
yeah, absolutely.
fact,
I mean,
it was
John Adams
becoming a signatory to the Declaration of Independence.
He rolled out of Independence Hall and right into nude dancing. There was no doubt about it.
Well, if we're talking about Franklin,
he loved nude sunbathing.
Yeah, he did. He loved a lot of things nude. So.
If you transported Franklin into post-modernity, I think he probably would have visited a strip club or two. But
that boy would have been sunning his balls like nobody's business. He would be test maxing. He would be red light enjoying. I'm absolutely sure that
maybe. We wanted to bring up the latest and striking visual images coming out of the United Kingdom. This has been making its rounds on social media the last couple of days. But this allegedly 14-year-old girl, it's hard to tell from the video quite what's going on. I think a girl and her sister, they are yelling at what we are told was and it sounds like when he speaks, a migrant in the UK holding a phone recording them. And the girl's claim in sort of Scottish English is that, you're basically attacking us. Stay away from my sister. She's only 12. And she brandishes not only one, but two bladed weapons at the same time. A Bowie knife of sorts of considerable length, 6 or 7 inches, it looked like to me, and a hatchet, one in each hand. And this is the report. She's now been arrested. I mean, she's a minor. Who knows what the charges will be. Police were called to St. Anne Lane, just off Cooper Angus Road in Lochee, in Scotland, shortly after 7:30 p.m. Saturday. It followed reports of a girl having a bladed weapon. Several police cars attended the scene at the Balgay Street car park following the report. Um, Police Scotland spokesperson said around 7:40 p.m. on Saturday, we received a report of a female youth with a bladed weapon in St. Anne Lane, Dundee. Officers attended, and a 14-year-old girl was charged in connection. She will be reported to the relevant authorities. But it's for obvious reason elicited now a mountain or an avalanche of memes, including a bunch of AI-produced art of a warlike-looking Scottish girl, defending her homeland. But the larger context for all of this is the unholy union of a huge surge in migrants to the UK, about 7% of the population of the UK since COVID, and the mix of native UK folks having this foisted upon them, mostly without their consent, also with a dramatic rise in crime by those migrants, many of whom are idle and not working and have plenty of time to get into various sorts of mischief. I now retract mischief because a lot of this involves pretty horrible crimes. I think the claim of these girls would be that it was about to be the probable beginning of one such crimes, that is, lots of sexual assault perpetrated on native Englanders or greater UKers by recent migrants. Just as one example, the recent imported folks from Afghanistan have a quite high crime rate as opposed to the native Englanders, and they're just one example among many. There's been these grooming gangs or rape gang stories of the last 6, 7, 8 years, and even longer in some places in the UK. And I just wanted to use it as a chance to plug our colleague Chris Caldwell's brand new essay from the new issue of the Claremont Review Books, which is online now and in mailboxes in the next couple weeks or so. This piece is called Land's End, the essay, Mass Migration Has Radicalized the United Kingdom. And Chris, in his inimitable way, has this wonderfully reported essay on the things that are afoot in the UK. And I just wanted to read a few paragraphs because they give you a nice gist of what's going on. He says the opposition, that is the opposition to the ruling classes, especially the Starmer government's attempt to argue to United Kingdomers that they just lie down and take all this. The opposition has not been stopped or daunted, merely reshaped into something that is more online and more anonymous. A whole new vocabulary has emerged to describe British politics. Not just two-tier, that is two-tier justice, but Boris wave, Deliveroo economy, and UK, spelled Yookay. The Boris wave is the name online commentators have given to the unprecedented migration levels of the last half decade. After having arduously won Brexit for the British electorate, which had voted for it largely to control borders and stop immigration, Prime Minister Boris Johnson was confronted with the COVID pandemic. Whatever else it may have done, COVID stopped migration altogether. Diluted by Office for Budget Responsibility statistical models that scored migrants as a straightforward increase to the country's wealth, Johnson and his advisors came to the conclusion that the shortfall in immigration was in and of itself an economic emergency. His cabinet relaxed its regulations on immigrants, and things went calamitously wrong. In little more than 3 years between 2021 and 2024, Britain admitted 4.5 million immigrants, close to 7% of the country's population today. 81% of them were non-EU nationals, and they were arriving at a time when more native Britons were leaving the country than returning. The result is a dramatic deterioration in the country's demographic stability. More than 40% of babies born in England last year have at least one foreign-born parent, and since Brexit, those parents have increasingly come from outside Europe. The expression Deliveroo economy refers to the social need that the newest migrants, whether asylum seekers or not, most visibly fill. They work shuttling food to upper-middle-class urbanites for the British equivalents of DoorDash and Uber Eats. Replacing technology with household help is not a route to higher productivity. It seems more like a route out of the first world and into the third. The UK has become UK. That is what the country is called in the extraordinary X-feed UK Aesthetics, curated by the pseudonymous Drukpa Kunli. This is one of the great parentheticals in all of CRB history. The name is that of a 16th century Tibetan Buddhist monk, poet, and sexologist, Avant Lalette, who posts photos, videos, video shorts, and articles that generally have the effect of making one vaguely sad, like an immigrant barmaid who doesn't know how to pour a pint of beer, or a podcast clip of two immigrants discussing how much they hate non Muslims under the heading Integration Update. Alongside a picture of a pretty and tidy Japanese girl in an enviably orderly Japan, captioned Stuck in the Past, one finds the text, Riddle me this. If Japan is so great, where are its Pakistani vape shops? The tone is always deadpan in this way, spitting back propaganda about the economic and cultural blessings of, quote, diversity in a way that makes it look not well meaning and progressive, but cynical and destructive. So that's a plug for Land's End. I encourage everyone to read everything Chris Caldwell writes, and the case holds for the latest issue of the Claremont Review books.
And we will be running that too at the American Mind. So just keep your eyes peeled for that, because it is a fantastic essay. It's, vintage Caldwell in every way, shape, and form. I mean, he's been studying that for decades. I think his book on it came out in maybe the late 90s, maybe early 2000s. But
yeah, Reflections on the Revolution in
Yep.
Europe. Yeah.
So if you haven't read that, would highly, highly recommend reading that. He's been doing a lot of work on that. And just seeing, and this is really kind of a test case where, Michael Anton would look at California and say, okay, if, we let Hillary Clinton win, if we let, Joe Biden, if we keep kind of letting people win in office, and not only that, but state governments and everywhere, if we just, basically keep acceding to the left, this is what's going to happen. So we look over now in the UK and we see under, Starmer's regime, I mean, this is what's going to happen, or what could happen with Trump winning. I think that's been, at least pushed off for a little while, that the United States could turn into. And these are questions that, again, we've actually dealt with the American Mind with Andrew Beck's assimilation essay and the symposium that we've been running for that. But these are questions really of such high importance. Who are we? What binds us together as a people? Certainly, there's culture, there's history. Obviously, with us being Claremont, there are certainly political ideas and core creeds that also kind of help bind that all together. Tom West, he talked about it in kind of the rider and the horse. The rider is the form, the matter. The horse is really, kind of really like the natural rights teaching of, say, the Declaration and the founders' political thought. And so, what is a country? And the UK is showing right now where they're forgetting just the basics of really who they were, the culture that birthed them. And it's really a test case for America, to say, look, we don't want to take that route, but we also want the UK to do well. I mean, we were born from them in many, many ways. Although with the founders, they would say, yes, we certainly, adopted parts of the common law, but that were only consistent with the natural law. So there's certainly a difference in what America did and how they took, from their forebears. But, this is a regime level problem and a civilizational problem. Do we want to succeed? Do we want to do well? And I think America is saying yes. Or do we want to just keep declining? I think Canada, the UK, and really the rest of the Western Anglosphere, says no. Rod Dodson had a great piece on this on Friday that just showed, through the military, through, the suicide regime, the MAID regime up in Canada, of what happens when a whole nation, a culture, really just loses the will to live. And it's a really sad thing.
Yeah, that video of the girl wielding her axe and blade or whatever they are is really interesting to me because, Ryan, you described it very well and very judiciously in that there's things we see and there's things we don't see. And as always, when a video goes mega viral on social media, you have to pay close attention to what's actually being depicted and what is as yet unknown. Here, there are still many unknowns. We don't actually know what happened to prompt the wielding of the blades. We don't know whether the girl's claims are true. They seem plausible to me, but that's because of my priors. And so I'm even more wary about proclaiming absolutely that this or that thing has happened. Having said that, I think it's really interesting that this girl has already become the emblem of a certain kind of desperate resistance against a wave of malfeasance by this massive kind of horde of immigrants, legally and illegally admitted to the UK, because it really demonstrates that this is an issue which has kicked over the traces. And it hardly matters anymore at this point what the particular facts are in this individual case. Of course, the truth always matters. But one of the things that I really admire about Chris Caldwell's essay is that he first shows in irrefutable numerical terms that a vast percentage of the UK's currently existing population has simply been transfused without democratic approval by the ruling class. And that these are people who, well-meaning though some of them may well be, have no connection to the ancestral land that they're being imported into, and there's really no way of knowing what their intentions are. And since there have been very real and demonstrable cases of serious sexual abuse, rape gangs, etc., that are going on, and that the government has studiously denied, the public are now at a place where they have no more patience for kind of carefully parsing the facts of this or that case. The fact pattern is so abundantly clear, and the studious resistance to admitting that fact pattern on the part of the ruling elite is also so clear that it no longer matters like what comes out of this or that particular instance. And so you get these situations, these huge flare-ups over one or the other particular case. One that Chris details is this series of riots in Southport, but there are a bunch of others. And it, again, the inciting incident is really just a kind of touch point. It's not the point of the situation overall, which is dire and which is going to lead in the next couple of years to something absolutely shocking that will happen in the UK, whether that's kind of it tips over just further into this disastrous situation, or whether there is a genuine populist revolution under Nigel Farage or somebody like him, which is also possible. We don't know the half of it in the States, despite the fact that we have had a terrible immigration crisis. Many, many mitigating circumstances set us apart from our brethren in the UK. One of which is that even the people that are coming here illegally come from countries with a European background and a Christian heritage that make the arrivals culturally closer to us. So if we develop the will to assimilate them, it will be much easier than if Britain does, because Britain is dealing with North African arrivals, Middle Eastern arrivals en masse, with a vastly different set of cultural assumptions, many of them abhorrent to the local population. Plus, there's the extremity of the legal and cultural attitudes on the part of the British elite, who are really European elite. And again, that's a different breed altogether, even from our admittedly dreadful left-wing elite. So for all of these reasons and others, what's going on in the UK is actually even more dramatic than what's going on over here. Chris's piece is so good about it. Run, don't walk. Everything he writes is good, but this is one of my favorite of his. And I'm being reminded by other Ryan, our producer, that I also read it aloud. So this is one of our new audio articles. You can listen to it on the CRB website and watch this space, because it's not the last you'll hear of it. ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com.
Yeah, probably because I went on too long. We have lost the time now for Cracker Barrel.
Maybe next week.
Maybe it'll stay alive through next week. The kerfuffle over the Cracker Barrel, disastrous Cracker Barrel rebrand. We can get removing the cracker and the barrel from the logo. Forgive me, Uncle, whatever your name is, who is the man sitting near the barrel. We'll see. One to keep an eye on. But we have to get to some cultural recommendations, and I know Spencer was excited about this week's cultural recommendation.
Do I get to go first? Even I'm so
please go for it.
Okay. Never in the history of this podcast have I had a cultural recommendation that I felt so sure would land with so many of our listeners and with 100% of the hosts of this podcast. Have either of you guys watched The Terminal List, this streaming TV show?
Yes, I have. Yep.
Have you read the novel of the same name by Jack Carr?
Mm-mm.
So
No.
The show, which is Chris Pratt as a Navy SEAL who winds up on the wrong side of the government conspiracy and has to basically kill off everybody that has done him wrong. And that's why it's called The Terminal List, not, as I initially thought, The Terminalist, as in one who terminates, but somebody who has a list of people who are terminally marked out for death, is based on this novel by Jack Carr, who I believe was also a SEAL. He writes an introduction about how he had to submit this book to the government and have parts of it redacted because it was so there's so much inside information, and that'll kind of give you a flavor for what sort of book this is. It is almost illiterate, and I say that with the deepest love in the world. With truly, I am enjoying this novel, but it contains paragraphs that are like, his attitude toward his daughter was one of deep love. Like, this is not written for people who can really suss out context clues or handle ambiguous prose. And there are typos, etc. Having said all of that, the airplane read is not dead, you guys. Back when I read Shogun, the giant doorstopper about the Portuguese, or rather the British emissary of the Portuguese traders who ends up in Japan, and I just thought this book is amazing, and there'll never be one written like it because people don't read books on planes anymore, so they don't buy these giant sagas and leaf through pulpy adventure stories. They watch the TV in the back of the seat or whatever. Boy, was I wrong. This is the airplane read of the 21st century. It's so entertaining and compelling. It's not as long, unfortunately, as Shogun, so you can't just like rely on it for an international flight to Japan or whatever. But well worth if you want to kind of shut your brain off and entertain yourself with a novel of extreme airplane quality. The Terminalist by Jack Carr.
So growing up, my mom was a huge Beatles fan. I think we burned through many tapes of listening to Sgt. Pepper. I think once she tried to put in Led Zeppelin album, and I actually started crying. I think I was like 2 or 3. I just wanted to listen to the Beatles over and over and over again. So anyway, on HBO, I found a series, a docu-series on George Harrison. So I started watching that. Very interesting. I mean, just kind of shines a light really into the early days of the Beatles too, where they were playing at the Cavern Club before their first album. I think they formed in 1960 as a band, and then they did a lot of shows, kind of like Van Halen, where they were really like a band way before that. They kind of figured out who they were. Ringo Starr, later came. Pete Best was their first drummer. And they really figured it out before their first album, and it really showed from the first album onward. And just the amazing changes they did. I mean, from Rubber Soul to Revolver to Sgt. Pepper. I mean, that's just one of like the biggest arcs of any band, I think, probably of all time. Just the maturation, increase in just their compositions. I mean, it's just incredible. Then the White Album after that, and then Abbey Road. But then also, so I just saw that on Disney Plus, they're going to be releasing this new anthology series. So that's going to be coming in November. And that's going to be a lot more behind the scenes footage that has never been seen before. So I'm very much looking forward to that. But anyway, if you haven't seen it, this George Harrison documentary, I think it came out in 2017, directed by Martin Scorsese too. So, obviously a great filmmaker that sure does not hurt things to tell that story. But I would, if you're a Beatles fan or just, even interested, I would definitely recommend watching that.
Excellent. I didn't have much by way of cultural recommendations, but Spencer has inspired me to recommend all of those James Clavell books in the Asia series, the Asia House series. I forget what they're called.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to read the rest of them. Please go on.
Yes.
I've only read the first one.
Spencer mentioned Shogun. I've also read Taipan, which is about the early days of Hong Kong and the founding of it, and it's the beginning of its flourishing. Gai Jin, I have not read. That's book 3. These are not exactly simultaneously linked works, but they're all sort of a theme. So hence they're sold as one big series if you want. And Gai Jin is set in 1862. The power of the shogun is waning, and the foreigners are there to make profit from all that. And then King Rat, which I also have read, which is set in a Japanese prisoner camp, and it's the prisoners sort of setting up an economy in rat meat, among other things. But it's about much more than that. And then Noble House is sort of spy games in Japan, or Hong Kong, I should say. And then they bring it all the way up to Whirlwind is the last one, and that's set in the 1970s. So if you wanted Clavell's epic series, and if you were maybe intrigued by the pacing and story and all that of Shogun, check out the rest of it. James Clavell, one of the
we should say
great airplane fiction writers of the mid to late 20th century.
Yes, and if you liked the show but haven't read the books, you don't know all the ways that the show is woke, because it's much subtler than shows that recast men as women or whatever. So it might have slipped under your radar that the original is way studlier and grittier and more fun and has a lot more sex in it also.
Oh, interesting, because there's a decent amount of sex in Shogun the series, but more in the book. Okay.
Way more like heaving bosoms and fainting maidens and weird commentary on the protagonist's equipment. But just generally, like, it's very kind of sex it's got sex on the brain in a way that the show hasn't, because, and again, this is secret ideology. The creators of the show, I'm pretty sure, didn't like the relationship at the center of the book, which is not actually pro-Western exactly, but it is very even-handed in its treatment of Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy. And for the show, the white man is basically a dumb idiot, and the Japanese girl has to like smack him around and
Right,
teach him the truth,
right.
etc.
Good. Yeah. So return to the source material, which is less culturally obnoxious and pernicious. Although I will say that the show was excellent, just as a piece of entertainment,
Mm,
and
really good.
well, fabulously and expensively produced and all that, and kind of epic and well acted. Okay, well, that's all the time we have for today. So thank you all again for listening to the Roundtable. If you'd like to look at more of the Claremont Institute's work, go to claremont.org. If you'd like to support our work, add a /donate at the end of claremont.org. Go, of course, to ClaremontReviewBooks.com. The new issue is up. A lot of it's paywalled, which you can get around. It's very easy. You just have to subscribe. And if you're a subscriber, you should get your issue in the next couple of weeks in the snail mail. And then our digital publication, of course, the namesake of this podcast, partly, AmericanMind.org, under the capable hands of Mike Sabo, one of our co-hosts. Lots of good stuff on there. And he mentioned you should check out our latest feature, which is our forum for discussion of things, with this lead essay on assimilation and a bunch of responses from interesting writers like John Fonte and Paul Gottfried and others. Jeremy Carl. What am I missing? To find out our latest work in Washington, D.C. and around the states, working on policy, education policy, and general anti-wokeness, including our American military project, go to dc.claremont.org. And please rate, subscribe, and review the show. Spread the word to your friends and family. And thank you all for listening. We will talk to you next week.